The Andes Cordillera runs like a frozen spine along the western edge of South America, a wall of stone and ice that separates nations and swallows weather systems whole. In the central range, above 13,000 feet, the air thins to the point where breath comes shallow and thought slows. Snow lies year-round on the peaks. The rock is volcanic and sharp. There are no roads, no settlements, no trees. The silence is absolute, except for wind. In October of 1972, this was the most remote terrain on the continent, visible only from the air, and even then barely mapped. Search planes could fly for days and see nothing but white. On the afternoon of October 13th, a twin-engine Fairchild turboprop carrying 45 passengers and crew departed Montevideo, Uruguay, bound for Santiago, Chile. The passengers were mostly young men, members of a rugby team from Stella Maris College in Montevideo, along with friends, family, and supporters. The flight plan called for a direct route across the Andes, a journey of less than 2 hours under clear conditions. Weather over the mountains that day was poor. The plane entered cloud cover shortly after crossing into Argentine airspace. Visibility dropped to 0. The pilots, relying on instruments and radio beacons, began their descent towards Santiago too early. They believed they had cleared the peaks. They had not. At 3:30 in the afternoon, the right wing struck a ridgeline. The wing sheared off. The tail section separated and fell away, taking several passengers with it. The fuselage, now a tube of aluminum with no wings and no tail, tobogganed down a steep snowfield at more than 200 miles per hour, bounced once, and came to rest in a narrow valley surrounded by peaks. 12 people died on impact or within hours. 33 survived the crash. They were at approximately 11,800 feet in a location no rescue team would think to search. The temperature at night dropped below 0 Fahrenheit. None of them were dressed for extreme cold. Most had never seen snow before. The fuselage had come to rest, tilted slightly downhill, half buried in snow. The interior was a tangle of seats, luggage, and bodies. The survivors pulled the dead outside and covered them with snow. They gathered the injured near the rear of the cabin, where a small amount of insulation remained. There was no radio. The plane's batteries were dead. The emergency locator beacon, if it functioned, was never heard. They had no map, no compass, no idea where they were. Some believed they had crashed in Chile, near the coast. Others thought they were still in Argentina. All assumed rescue was imminent. The expedition had been organized casually. These were not mountaineers. They were students, most in their late teens and early 20s, middle-class boys from Montevideo who played rugby on weekends and attended mass on Sundays. A few were older parents, friends, a grandmother. None had survival training. They wore street clothes, light jackets, slacks, loafers. The plane had carried no emergency rations beyond a few chocolates and bottles of wine purchased in Mendoza during a layover. The rugby team had packed for a weekend tournament, not a mountain ordeal. The survivors found 8 bars of chocolate, a tin of mussels, some candy, and several bottles of alcohol. Rationed carefully, this lasted 2 days. By the 3rd day, the reality of their situation began to clarify. No planes had been spotted. The cold was relentless. Frostbite appeared on fingers and toes. The injured, those with broken legs, fractured ribs, internal bleeding lay wrapped in thin blankets, shivering. The survivors melted snow for water using aluminum sheets held in the sun. They stuffed the fuselage's broken windows with luggage and seat cushions to block wind. At night, they huddled together for warmth, bodies pressed tight, no space wasted. Sleep came in brief intervals. The altitude caused headaches and nausea. Breathing required effort. There was no firewood, no fuel, no way to generate heat, except with their own bodies. On the 4th day, one of the survivors, a medical student named Roberto Canessa, raised the question no one had been willing to voice. There was no food. There would be no food unless rescue arrived immediately. The only source of protein available was the bodies of the dead, preserved by cold, lying under snow a few meters from where they slept. The suggestion was met with silence. Some of the survivors were devoutly Catholic. All had been raised in a culture where desecration of the dead was unthinkable. The bodies outside included friends, teammates, relatives. To consume them was to cross a boundary most could not even name. The discussion that followed was not recorded in detail, but its contours are known. Some argued that death was imminent without food, that survival justified any means. Others said they would rather die than commit such an act. A few invoked theological reasoning. If God had placed them here, and if their bodies were the only means of survival, then perhaps this was permissible under divine law. One of the survivors suggested that if he died, the others should use his body. Others agreed. This became the framework: mutual consent, sacramental logic, necessity. On the 8th day, a small group of survivors, led by Canessa and another medical student, cut flesh from a body and ate it raw. They did not speak while doing so. They did not look at each other. Some vomited. Most could not bring themselves to participate. By the 10th day, nearly all had. The act was never casual. Each time, there was hesitation, nausea, prayer. They referred to the flesh as meat, never naming what it was. They avoided faces and hands. They used broken glass and metal to cut. The flesh was frozen, difficult to chew, tasteless. It provided enough calories to prevent starvation, but not enough to restore strength. The survivors began to lose weight steadily. Their bodies consumed muscle mass. Movement became labored. Thought slowed. They spent most of each day lying still, conserving energy, waiting for rescue that did not come. On the 10th day, a transistor radio inside the fuselage picked up a faint broadcast. The survivors gathered around it and heard, through static, a news report stating that the search for their plane had been called off. The authorities had concluded that no one could have survived this long in the mountains. The search teams had been looking in the wrong location, hundreds of miles north, and had found nothing. The broadcast continued for a few seconds, then faded. The survivors sat in silence. The realization settled over them slowly. No one was coming. If they were to leave this place, they would have to walk out on their own. The valley where they had crashed was enclosed on all sides by peaks that rose several thousand feet above them. Snow covered everything. There were no trails, no landmarks, no way to orient themselves. Several survivors attempted short climbs in the days following the crash, but all were turned back by altitude, cold, and exhaustion. The snow was deep and unstable. Each step required lifting the leg high and plunging it down again. Progress was measured in meters per hour. Frostbite set in quickly. The strongest among them could manage only a few hundred meters before collapsing. 2 weeks after the crash, an avalanche struck the fuselage during the night. Snow poured through the open tail section and filled the interior within seconds. The survivors, asleep and packed tightly together, were buried. 8 suffocated before they could be dug out. The avalanche reduced the number of survivors to 19. It also buried much of their remaining supplies and made the fuselage even colder and more cramped. The dead from the avalanche were left inside for days because there was no room to move them and no strength to dig. Eventually, they were placed outside with the others. The survivors continued. By the 5th week, the group had organized itself into roles. A few managed the water supply, melting snow each day in makeshift trays. Others handled the rationing of flesh, cutting and distributing it in small portions. Some kept watch for planes. A rotating group worked to insulate the fuselage, packing snow into gaps, arranging seat cushions as bedding. Discipline was maintained through routine. Each person had a task. Conflict was rare but not absent. Tensions arose over food distribution, over who was doing more work, over religious interpretation. Some continued to pray daily, framing their survival as a test of faith. Others stopped praying altogether. The decision to send an expedition out of the mountains was made in late November. It was clear by then that no rescue would occur. The only option was to walk. 2 men were chosen: Roberto Canessa and Fernando Parado. Parado's mother and sister had died in the crash. He had been unconscious for 3 days afterward and had nearly been given up for dead. He was not the strongest, but he was the most determined. Canessa was pragmatic, methodical, and had some medical knowledge. A third man, Antonio Vizintin, would accompany them part way. They spent a week preparing, eating extra rations to build strength, fashioning warmer clothing from seat covers and insulation, filling a sock with flesh to carry as food. On December 12th, 60 days after the crash, the three men set out. They climbed west toward what they believed was Chile. The ascent took 2 days. The altitude caused dizziness and vomiting. They moved slowly, resting every few steps, breathing hard. At the summit, they expected to see green valleys and the Chilean coast. Instead, they saw only more mountains, ridge after ridge, extending to the horizon. Parado later described this moment as the worst of the entire ordeal. Vizintin turned back. Canessa and Parado continued west. They walked for 9 days. They crossed glaciers, forded rivers, descended scree slopes, and navigated forests at lower elevations. They had no map, no compass, no certainty they were moving in the right direction. They slept without shelter, huddled together for warmth. Their feet blistered and bled. The flesh they carried ran out after 5 days. On December 21st, they reached a river valley and saw cattle. They followed the river downstream and encountered a man on horseback, a Chilean muleteer named Sergio Catalan, who brought help. 2 days later, on December 23rd, helicopters lifted the remaining 14 survivors from the crash site. The rescue was difficult. The altitude and terrain made it impossible to land. Survivors were lifted out 1 or 2 at a time, using a hoist. The operation took 2 days. The last man left the fuselage 72 days after the crash. The bodies of the dead were left on the mountain, partially consumed, frozen in snow. Families were told. Some requested that the remains be left undisturbed. Others insisted on recovery. A second expedition retrieved some bodies the following summer. The survivors did not speak publicly about what they had done for several weeks. When the story emerged, reactions were divided. Some called them heroes, others called them cannibals. The Catholic Church issued a statement saying that, under extreme necessity, the act was not sinful. The survivors themselves were careful in how they framed it. They spoke of consent, of prayer, of viewing the bodies as a gift from the dead. They did not apologize, but they also did not glorify. Most returned to ordinary life. Some became doctors, engineers, businessmen. A few wrote books. Parado and Canessa returned to the crash site years later and stood in silence where the fuselage had been. What occurred in the Andes was not unprecedented. History contains other incidents where survivors consumed the dead. The Donner Party in 1846, the Greely expedition in 1884, various shipwrecks and famines. What made the Andes incident unusual was the length of time involved, the number of survivors, the youth of those involved, and the way they discussed it afterward. They did not hide. They did not lie. They said they had prayed, they had chosen to live, and they had honored the dead by surviving. Faith, in this context, was not abstract. It structured how the survivors interpreted their situation, how they justified their actions, how they maintained cohesion. It also divided them. Some believed they had been chosen by God to endure a test. Others felt abandoned. A few lost faith entirely. The daily recitation of the rosary became both a comfort and a source of tension. Those who prayed found meaning in ritual. Those who did not found it empty. Yet the group stayed together. No one left alone. No one gave up and wandered into the snow. Hunger was the simplest fact of their existence, but faith shaped how they responded to it. The event forced a question that most people never have to answer. What does it mean to survive when survival requires violating your deepest principles? The survivors chose to live, but they did so with full awareness of the cost. Some of them have said in interviews that they think of the dead every day. Others say they have made peace with it. None claim it was easy. The line between endurance and desecration is not clear. It depends on context, on necessity, on who is judging. The survivors crossed that line because the alternative was death. Whether that makes them saints or sinners depends on where you stand. The Andes are indifferent. The snow still falls. The peaks still rise above the tree line. The valley where the fuselage came to rest is unmarked except by a cross placed there years later. The mountains do not remember, but the men who walked out of them do. They carry it quietly as a fact of their lives, as a thing that happened and cannot unhappen. They were strangers before the crash, teammates and acquaintances. They became something else on that mountain, people who shared not just a fuselage, but a choice, a hunger and a faith that held or broke, depending on the day. What emerged from that was not a lesson, but a record. This is what human beings can do when there is no other way.